in a nutshell, my elevator pitch to explain this to anyone is to understand how people get good ideas to do bad things.
Welcome to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. I'm your host, Keith Sawyer. That was Dr. Hansika Kapoor. She's a creativity researcher based in Mumbai, India. She studies what she calls dark creativity. It's the ways that creativity can be used for harmful or unethical purposes. If you like this episode, I hope you click like or choose it as a favorite or comment on the show. Please spread the word to anyone you know who's interested in creativity. Now, here's our interview. I'm here with Hansika Kapoor. Hansika, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Keith. Lovely to be here.
You're really well known internationally for your creativity research. I'm really happy to have you here to talk about a lot of your research. You've worked in a lot of different areas. You've talked about dark creativity. You've talked about the art bias, anger, disgust, moral transgressions. So could you say a little bit about yourself? Who are you and what kind of research do you do?
Sure. To start in a nutshell, I'm a researcher based in Mumbai, India, and my primary area of work is creativity, more specifically the dark side of creativity, which has been overlooked for quite a long time in academic literature. And within dark creativity comes a whole host of areas, sub-themes. As you said, there could be moral emotions like anger, disgust. There could be things related to misinformation or the creation of fake news, which is disinformation, the intentional spread of false information. And at the same time, I do a little bit of work in the creativity of good things, so to speak. So I do study how implicit biases exist within creativity literature. We've all assumed as creativity researchers that people have an art bias, but we didn't really explore it until recently, formally explore it at that there are certain professions that are more likely to be perceived as creative as compared to others. So about me, I've worked all my life here in Mumbai in India. I studied here. I did my postdoc at the University of Connecticut with James Kaufman. And from there, I think a lot of my dark creativity work has really taken off, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Can you say a little bit more about dark creativity? Because I think most of us think of creativity as a happy, positive thing, and dark sounds not happy and positive. So what is dark creativity?
Absolutely. I think in general, creativity is a good, positive, encouraging, useful attribute to have. However, when we start conceptualizing the creative process, we realize that the creative process is actually blind, in that it's amoral, in that unless we wield it to meet a certain type of end, it could go any way. And a lot of the research that had looked at creativity science in the last 75 years, so to speak, ever since creativity research started increasing, has looked at the bright side. And that's very important. We want to know how to foster creativity in children. We want to understand how creativity is related to imagination. But more recently, in the last 3 decades, or let's say peppered across the last 3 decades, some researchers started asking, but what happens if we apply the same creative process, the same originality, the same ingenuity to meet negative ends or evil ends, damaging goals? And that's where the dark side of creativity comes in. In a nutshell, my elevator pitch to explain this to anyone is to understand how people get good ideas to do bad things.
Can you give an example of dark creativity?
Absolutely. Coming up with a new way to cheat on a test so that you can score higher as compared to your peers is a very common example, which is dark in a sense that it's self-fulfilling. You're doing it out of your own selfish interests. But then dark creativity can also bend into damaging society, damaging other people. So think about coming up with a new way to hide your extramarital affair from your spouse or your partner. Now that's damaging, and that's implying the use of originality for meeting a nefarious end, a nefarious goal. So dark creativity appears once you start realizing where what it means. It appears in multiple contexts. You start noticing it left, right, and center, and you'll start realizing that, oh, the fact that it's negative, or the fact that it's even evil in some cases, doesn't necessarily have to detract from it being original.
Right, right. That makes sense that if you're harming someone, then yeah, I think a lot of us would agree that might be a definition of bad or immoral, harming someone else. So if you come up with an original idea for hiding your affair, that constitutes a form of harm for your partner in this case.
Absolutely, it does. And sometimes we characterize these dark creative ideas as really involving another person. Maybe there's a victim at hand, for instance. Maybe it's a victimless creative crime, so to speak. So there are variations and gradations of harm and of damage that can be caused through such original thinking as well. And just as not all creativity is equal, not all dark creativity is equal either. Someone could come up with an original way to present an idea on canvas, for example. Similarly, someone would come up could come up with an original way to vandalize that same artwork.
Well, I'm a cognitive psychologist, so I think about what goes on in the mind when people are being creative. And my first guess would be that whether it's dark creativity or bright creativity, that what's going on in your mind is essentially the same cognitive processes. So, what have you found in your research?
That's a great question. And honestly, we don't know much about this as yet. So I remember when I was finishing up my PhD, I did do one study, I did do one experiment using an EEG, which is an electroencephalograph, where you put a cap on consenting participants, and that cap has several electrodes attached to it, and then you record their brainwave activity while they're performing a task. And the thing was that my study was, honestly, it was inconclusive about whether there are any neural differences between dark and bright creative thinking patterns. And this was way back in 2018. More recent work in 2024 and even this year have started identifying some discernible patterns in neural processes using the same methodology and EEG to understand whether there are certain parts of your brain that are perhaps lighting up differently or functioning differently when you're thinking about negative or darkly creative ideas as opposed to happy, good, creative ideas. And that I find that to be really, really interesting work in trying to distinguish between what's happening in the brain when you're coming up with these ideas.
Right. And I can imagine that there might be a separate part of the brain for morality or for goodness and evil. And then if you're doing something that you know is bad, then your brain is going to be different because you're doing bad stuff. And if you're doing something you know is good, it might be a different part of your brain that lights up. But then creativity could be a completely different part of your brain. It might be separate from the morality part of your brain.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that creativity and morality are woven together? Or would it be more likely that there's a creativity part of your brain and then a separate morality part of your brain?
Oh no, I certainly think that we don't know enough about how this would play out in a neural context. I do believe that there would be an overlap. So for instance, a really simple example is that when you're thinking about a darkly creative idea, you're more likely than not to use deception or to use some form of lies of omission or commission or some form of trickery in order to come up with a darkly creative idea. lying is more cognitively effortful in the human brain, and therefore there are different neural pathways that, or different brain waves that are going to be activated when you are lying versus when you are telling the truth. And that's primarily because lying involves suppressing the truth. Interestingly enough, some of those brainwave activation patterns are also common in when you're being creative, in creative idea generation. So I do think that at some level there's going to be an overlap, and I don't know whether we would be able to very discernibly distinguish between, well, creative part A of your brain and moral part B of your brain, because I do think that the two are going to be inextricably intertwined.
I never thought about that lying as a psychological study, and that lying is more cognitively effortful because you have to suppress what you know is the truth. But then if you're telling the truth, you don't have that suppression activity that your brain has to do. Did I get that right?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that's what I did in my PhD. And some of that work is being replicated, or we're trying to do it in a more sophisticated manner with colleagues at the University of Graz in Austria, Corina Postol Stefan, who's another great researcher in this field. She, James Kaufman, and I are collaborating on precisely this study to try and understand whether when we're lying with different goals in mind, whether we're lying to protect someone's feelings versus whether we're lying to cover up a mistake in a creative way, whether that fires up different brainwave patterns.
So there is some lying that would not be harmful to others and might actually help other people.
Oh, exactly. And that's the great part about understanding and studying constructs in this blind, amoral way, because creativity has long been associated, or has been implicitly associated, with goodness, like you said. Similarly, deception has also been associated with something that is wrong or morally incorrect. But there is something called pro social deception and pro social lying, where you actually lie in order to save someone's feelings, or you lie in order to protect somebody else from getting hurt, for example. So these constructs are not necessarily value laden, they are value neutral. And once we start examining them in the context of other value that is attributed to it, it makes its study very, very interesting.
And it seems like that could be pretty fuzzy. For example, the example of lying when you're having an affair and telling your partner you're not having the affair, you might think to yourself that you're protecting your partner because you know they'd be hurt if they knew about your affair. So you could sort of fool yourself into thinking that you're doing a good thing by hiding the affair. But then your cognitive part of your brain, the creativity part, I think it would be operating the same way, whichever way you're thinking.
Precisely. And that's where intent comes in. If you're hiding an affair to justify to yourself that, oh, I'm protecting my partner's feelings, then you're probably going to continue engaging in that behavior. But if it's coming from a place of malice, or it's coming from a place of intentional damage or an irreparable relationship, then the intent is going to change, and your motivation to continue lying is also going to change.
That's fascinating. And I've seen the titles of a lot of your academic journal articles because I went through your CV to prepare for this interview. And I see words like moral transgressions. So if you're the person who's doing this, you're lying and you're morally transgressing. I mean, it sounds like a really horrible type of person to be. I mean, how could you live with yourself? Don't you know that you're doing this horrible thing?
I know it's a pretty dark area to reconcile that I'm interested in researching. But if evolution would have taken care of all of the cheaters and the scammers, then we would be in a better place. However, our it's called the cheater detection module, right? Evolutionarily, that we were able to spot people who are going to not fulfill obligations toward us. And that cheater detection module doesn't seem to be as sophisticated as it should, because there are still people who are going to take us for a ride, or there are still people who are going to come up with more inventive ways to scam us or trick us or fool us. And I think, in essence, that is the interesting thing to study, because just because of the fact that they are scammers or tricksters or thieves or criminals doesn't necessarily mean that they're not using some type of creative process in order to meet their ends.
Oh, that's a great example of the computer scammers, where sometimes people say it's like an arms race. So the scammers come up with a new creative way to fool people into giving them money. And then the good people, the ones who are protecting us by putting in the spam detection in all of our computer systems, so they're going to develop new protections for the new scamming techniques. But then the scammers develop yet another new attack, and the protectors have to develop a new protection. So
Mhm.
it seems to me like that arms race absolutely involves creativity.
Yes, because you do need to stay one step ahead of ingenious scams or ingenious criminals, and law enforcement can only do so much. So if you remember from the book and the movie Catch Me If You Can, Frank Abagnale eventually starts consulting with the FBI, if I'm not mistaken, because they need to know what other criminals are thinking or are up to in order to stay one step ahead of them.
So if the cognitive processes are similar for the scammers, and we would say that's dark creativity, then those processes are similar to what we're doing when we're doing positive, happy things. Do you think that your research of dark creativity could help the rest of us? I mean, could it help us be more creative in a positive way? Does it transfer from being dark to bright?
That kind of retraining is something that we want to eventually achieve. But the truth is that right now, we're still exploring the dark side and its many, many terrible facets. So, ideally, yes, we do want to try and retrain the creative process to meeting a positive end, so that originality is not being used for negative, nefarious goals. But I don't think we're just there yet.
That leads me to a question about something that's at the top of your CV, where you say it's your research question guiding your whole career. And one of those questions is to make the creativity research discipline more practical, or you're trying to help people in their everyday lives. So you would hope that your research could have some practical implications.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why I study dark creativity is to help make individuals aware about how creativity can be weaponized as well. Because unless we acknowledge that criminals or scammers or thieves, call them what you may, are not necessarily dumb or daft or not using their intellectual capacities, that's when we start realizing that we're up against something very, very ingenious, inventive. Think about the Louvre heist that just happened. That was a pretty good screenplay for the next Oceans movie, for example. So I think one of the things that I want to focus on after, of course, scoping a lot of dark creativity work across various domains is to understand how we can ensure that we mitigate the costs associated with people engaging in such dark creativity, because I think the first step is to acknowledge that it exists.
I was thinking about personal differences too, or personality traits. So, are there some people that are more likely to use dark creativity, or maybe you could say who are better at it? Are there individual differences in dark creativity?
Yes, absolutely. So, in my own research, I have found that individuals who are more likely to exhibit darker personality traits, such as psychopathy or Machiavellianism, manipulativeness, narcissism, sadism, everyday sadism, or taking pleasure in watching other people's pain, they're more likely to come up with these kinds of dark ideas, dark original ideas. And similarly, individuals who have a great deal of moral flexibility, or they don't necessarily have such rigid moral concerns across various domains, they're more likely to push the envelope when it comes to creativity.
You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you're enjoying the episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and rate the show and leave a comment, because it helps people like you find the show. You can find The Science of Creativity on all podcast platforms. It sounds like something that would be really hard to study. I mean, you have to recruit research subjects, and then you'd want some of them to be amoral people. So can you give an example of a research study where, how do you get these subjects? I mean, how do you study them?
Sure. So most of my work, at least the empirical stuff, has been in collaboration with James Kaufman. And we try and collect data both from India as well as from the US, just so that there is some kind of sample variability. And it isn't necessarily only a phenomena that is being studied in one context as compared to multiple countries. And what we do is we design a survey, we design a questionnaire that's circulated online, and we try as far as possible to recruit a general population. So, a general population would mean a combination of students and employed persons, maybe retired individuals, but as general as possible so that we can, of course, generalize the findings for later, and so that we're not studying only student samples. Now, this doesn't go as well as we want it to often, and sometimes our studies are comprised primarily of student samples just because that's the way research is, and that's the sample or the population that we have the most access to. But the good thing about the research that we do is honestly that all of the constructs that we're studying, be it morality, creativity, personality, deception, they are all distributed in a normal curve, which means that there'll be a bunch of people in the middle and then few people that'll have very, very low creativity or are at the far end of some morality. And there would be another group of very few people that have very, very high creativity and are very, very moral, for example. So, to answer your question about how do we find individuals like this, these are all normally distributed traits and attributes in the general population. So, it isn't that difficult as we thought it would be. It's definitely more difficult to find individuals who come up with extremely negatively creative ideas. But there are different tasks that we use in order to facilitate that type of thinking, just because we want to understand that type of thinking and not obviously condone it.
Well, now I'm getting a little bit self-conscious, and I'm wondering, am I one of those people who use dark creativity and I just don't know about it? Are these people who don't know that this is the way they are, or maybe they would deny it if you confronted them? I mean, how do you know?
So the another good thing about this research is that there are two kinds of darkly creative participants. One type that will think of an idea. They may think about the most egregious idea about how they could ruin somebody's wedding by sleeping with the groom, for example, all right? But then they would never act on it. So they allow that moral boundary to be crossed only hypothetically, but in reality, behaviorally, they would never cross that moral boundary. And it's really interesting because we've actually been able to have various types of participants in our studies, ranging from those people who would say, I'm never going to do anything wrong at all, regardless of whether this is an anonymized survey or not, right up to people who would say that, oh, yeah, I would probably do this in real life. But the proportion of people who would only think it is much, much higher.
Right, right. It would be like someone who's in a very abusive romantic relationship and then you get separated. So maybe you're fantasizing about, I don't know, hurting them in some way. I don't want to suggest ways to hurt someone,
Yeah.
but yeah, I could imagine you're thinking of all the horrible things that you would do to them, but you would never actually do it.
Exactly. And that's at least I try and call it a moral speed bump or a moral handbrake. And different people have that speed bump at different places. So some people wouldn't even think about doing terrible things. Some people would think about doing not so terrible things. And then there would be other people who would think about absolutely the worst, but would never do it in real life. And then there's that extremely small proportion of people who would actually act on their wild creative ideas.
I just thought of an example that comes up in my life. I'm a college professor. I'm teaching undergraduates and graduate students. And my colleagues and I, we've noticed recently a greater likelihood of students cheating in various ways. And it's not only using generative AI. I mean, some instructors have a no AI policy, and then the students use AI anyway. And then we have these AI detectors that detect it. But then there's other types of cheating that just seem to be increasing in prevalence. And I wonder, what are the students thinking? Are they just immoral people, people who just don't care that they're doing something evil? Or what stories do they tell themselves? They probably don't think it's dark creativity. I mean, maybe they can justify it to themselves in some way. So let's talk a little bit about that, about students and the type of cheating that goes on. So yeah, is that dark creativity?
It's a really interesting question, and this is something that I explored in my postdoc that I did in before the AI revolution. So this was in 2019, 2020. And I asked this exact same question about how cheating represent a form of dark creativity? And through a qualitative and a quantitative exercise, what I came to realize is that cheating in any form. So think about a toddler disrupting class versus college student not reading up on an essay before a class. Any form of cheating is conceptualized as resistance, classroom resistance. And classroom resistance comes to play when students feel that they don't have enough agency. Now, in the context of AI, things get pretty complicated because here there are not just implications of a lack of creativity because everyone's using AI, which automatically means that it's not creative to do that anymore because this has become the norm and this is not the exception. But also, it's cognitively offloading so much of your brain and your thinking capacity that universities and schools are churning out individuals who, well, know how to use AI really well, but may not be able to critically engage with content. And that's really scary. So I don't think that the form of cheating today, especially in terms of AI use, is a form of dark creativity. I don't know whether there may be a subsection of students who are doing it out of malice or with a malicious intent. But right now, I think it's more a form of resistance, not even expressing agency. It's just I don't want to take the effort to learn. And honestly, as an educator, as a researcher, that's extremely disheartening and saddening.
I agree. And you made a comment a few minutes ago that there's lying that is not creative. I guess using AI to generate a paper isn't creative because a lot of people have done it already. So it's cheating, but it's not dark creativity. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I think, especially because, as I said, this is the go to option now that I don't want to think about my assignment or I don't want to engage with this reading. And therefore, I'm just going to offload my cognition onto an LLM that is going to do the heavy work for me.
This topic is a good transition to another study that you've done. You found that creativity adds to GPA to predict educational outcomes. I mean, we know that GPA in a college application seems to have some predictive ability for how well you're going to do in college. And then your new finding is that if you assess creativity, then you can predict even better someone's performance than if you use only the GPA. Is that right?
Yes, and in fact, it's GPA and personality. So there are some personality traits such as conscientiousness, which basically encompasses how diligent you are, how rule abiding you are, whether you meet your deadlines on time, and things like that. That is also associated with better academic performance, especially on standardized tests. But what we found is that regardless of GPA as well as personality, like taking those into account, despite that, creativity still predicted better standardized test scores, which says a lot to understand the value and the worth of teaching for creativity.
It sounds similar to some work that Bob Sternberg did, and I had him on the show a few months ago. I remember he tried to introduce a required creativity test that students would use in their college applications.
I believe so, yes. But I honestly don't know what happened about that. But it would be interesting. It would be important. We know creativity is a 21st century skill. We know that the use of AI is either going to destroy human creativity or amplify it even further, depending on the context. And now we also know that creativity can facilitate these run of the mill academic test scores that I'm sure parents and children alike would be very, very happy to know about. It's just about how we then begin to foster creativity or encourage creativity amongst students.
And when you say creativity in your research, I assume you have a quantitative measure, like a paper and pencil test. So, how do you assess creativity in your research?
In multiple ways. So, creativity assessment is very diverse. In general, we would think about tests that focus on some kind of creative production. So, that creative production could be in the form of a drawing, it could be in the form of solutions to a problem, for example. And at the same time, we can also think of creativity as a self report measure. So, something like a questionnaire or a scale that you would give to someone else and then ask them to rate how well they think they can perform certain types of creative activities or whether they have done that in the past. So there are various ways to measure this. In this particular study, the one with the students and GPA, I believe we had multiple measures of creativity, one of which involved adding a caption to a cartoon, for example. So multiple ways to measure this. And then there are raters that would rate the responses on the basis of originality, task appropriateness, or any other variables that would be relevant.
So, would you recommend to college administration that they add a creativity test to their required student applications?
I mean, I'm not a big fan about standardized tests in the academic context, but sure, it would be interesting. But at the same time, this isn't something that, or creativity rather, isn't something that you have or you don't. It isn't binary. There are obviously gradations, and it would be more interesting to know what college administrators plan to do with these levels of creativity if assessed, and how those would impact whether individuals get college admissions or not. Because I don't think that that's a defining feature in the sense that we want it to operate in the admission context.
And you wouldn't want to just require that they be already creative when they start college. You would want to have some education in college to help them enhance their creativity. I mean, you're a college, you're supposed to be teaching. So, do you think that there are ways that you can teach people to be more creative?
There are. I think there are various interventions, quote unquote, behavioral strategies, allowing yourself to be bored once in a while, allowing yourself to engage in a playful mindset, things like that. So, definitely, there are ways to teach, quote unquote, people to have that kind of creative mindset. But again, if you're talking about a format of creativity that requires structured practice, such as will I be able to be creative while I'm playing the guitar, you will still have to learn basic chords before you start improvising. So I think with all of creativity, or most of creativity, that's what we aim for, at least when we quote unquote teach how to be creative.
That leads me to another body of your research. It's the art bias, you call it. So tell me about that. What do you mean by the art bias?
So the art bias is a term that we thought had been established and has been studied in the context of different types of organizations or professions. And some work has been done in this area. However, what we wanted to study is specifically whether this bias towards artists being creative and not any other profession, or other professions being less creative, how strong that is in an implicit sense as well as in an explicit sense. So, what we did was we devised an implicit association test, and we wanted to study whether individuals would categorize words related to artistic professions, scientific professions. We wanted to study using an implicit association test whether there was an implicit bias associating artistic, scientific, and conventional professions against each other. And what we found is individuals implicitly and explicitly consider artistic professions such as musicians, photographers, artists themselves to be highly, highly creative, as opposed to conventional professions like a clerk or a manager. They were considered to be very, very low on creativity. And then there were scientific and business oriented professions that were somewhere in the middle, which was very interesting because there was no hierarchical order to science and business in terms of creativity. We just knew that artistic professions are the most creative, conventional ones are the least. But between science and business, we actually didn't find a difference, which was pretty interesting. And maybe some of the future work can look at whether there is a hierarchical association or hierarchical order between scientific and business oriented professions in that way in terms of creativity.
So this is a study where you interview just everyday people and you ask them what they think, or you give them an implicit bias test, and you're finding that most people associate art with greater creativity than something like science or accounting or whatever as lower creativity. And you're finding that's the case in your research. I mean, it makes sense to me that people would have that bias. In my own research, I study art and design. So I guess I'd ask you, what are the implications of that research? Why is it a problem that someone might associate art with greater creativity?
So it isn't necessarily a problem that people associate art with creativity, but that they don't associate other professions with creativity. So it doesn't necessarily mean that finding a new way to solve a problem or to make your work simpler or easier has to be restricted, or has to be restricted only to a certain type of profession. I think the emphasis that we were trying to make in the art bias paper is that there are different professions other than artists that also have certain components of originality and creativity that can make those professions seem a little more interesting. For example, creative accounting, or for example, even in science, scientific creativity is such a large area and field of study. And coming down to conventional occupations, I remember seeing a video of floor sweeper who was cleaning a certain area, who devised a novel way to make sure that well, not a speck of dust was seen. And I think the implication of the art bias paper is that creativity and originality can emerge in any profession, regardless of where it categorizes within that framework. So it's not only restricted to artistic professions, is the takeaway from that paper.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you got that finding because it's something I've been saying all the time when I talk to people, that there's everyday creativity and it uses basically the same mental processes as the exceptional creativity of an artist or a designer.
Absolutely. That creative process can be integrated into any professional or occupational space. It doesn't have to be reserved for the musicians and the photographers.
There's one last set of questions that we haven't gotten to yet. And again, this is on your CV when you state what your career is about. One thing that you say is that you want to study creativity in the context of India. So can you say a little bit about that? What do you find to be the case with creativity in India?
That's an interesting question. So, in India, we have a term that represents resourceful, quick, clever, cunning problem solving, and that term is jugard. And a lot of the work that I've been doing in dark creativity and in creativity in general has been inspired by trying to understand or conceptualize this jugard a little better, because in a resource strapped environment or in an environment that has material constraints, individuals have to create makeshift solutions or bootstrap ideas in order to essentially survive, not just problem solve. And in the Indian context, I think there could be some pockets or spaces or even communities that may be better at coming up with these darkly creative ideas as opposed to others, and as opposed to other individuals from other nations as well. And I think that's where my interest in studying really dark creativity comes from. It's a very culturally integrated part of the place that I come from.
That really is fascinating, and I never thought about it that way. I always like to wrap up our interviews by asking, do you have some advice or some sort of exercise that our listeners might be able to do in the coming week, something that might enhance their creativity?
Sure. I think my go-to advice is to embrace boredom. So the next time you find yourself feeling bored, instead of reaching out to your phone and doom scrolling or checking your email or doing whatever else you would do on your phone, try and stay with that boredom. Maybe it'll spark an idea, maybe it'll spark a thought that is novel for you or that you can implement or work on. But I think today more than ever, with the kind of information that we're continuously being bombarded with and inundated with, we're finding it more and more difficult to find these pockets of time where we're allowing ourselves to be bored. So I think my advice would be, the next time you find yourself bored, feel bored.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today on the Science of Creativity.
Thanks, Keith. It was lovely being here.
You've been listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, share the podcast with anyone you know who's interested in the science behind creativity. To learn more, visit keithsawyer.com or sawyerpodcast.com, and you can follow The Science of Creativity on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.